National Science Foundation focused on the Four Corners region, how water brings communities together, right? So we're working with a lot of different communities, a lot of Latinx communities, rural kind of ranching and farming communities, and we're saying that trying to provide this message that you might water is something that we all have in common, access to water as a important part of our livelihood. It's something that can bring us together, and it's also something that's scarce, especially in that region. It's something that we need to protect. So this program today with the Avarna Group is meant to talk about a little bit about community engagement, how you can reach out, how you can bring your communities together, and how you can kind of work with, bring different cultures together, and do your engaging library programs. All right, I'm already kind of belaboring this introduction a little bit. I'll go ahead and turn it over. But if you have any questions about that project, please reach out to me, or if you have any questions about any of the work we do at the Space Science Institute or at StarNet Libraries, please reach out to me. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over. I guess at Sienna, are you speaking for?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to turn things
Uh,
over to Sienna. I'll be in the
Thank
chat.
you.
Good to see everybody.
Thanks so much, Brooks. Hi, everyone. My name is Sienna. My pronouns are she, her, and I am zooming in from Muskogee Indigenous Lands in the greater Atlanta area. I'm a partner here at the Avarna Group, and we do a variety of different things around people, culture, connecting organizations to the communities that they serve and making sure that the voices of the folks that they serve are actually centered in the way that they build their programs and policies and systems. And I will go ahead and pass it over to Aparna to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aparna. I'm the one of the founding partners at the Avarna Group. I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm calling you from the homelands of the Kalapuya people in Eugene, Oregon. And my background is I was in science. I was a chemist and also did some groundwater hydrology before eventually landing in this role here, supporting organizations that do science work, that do environmental work, and that do education work, and really embedding ideas around fairness and belonging, and really, again, as Sienna said, centering those who are most impacted by your work in the ways that you shape the work itself. So that's me, and I'll share my screen and hand it back off to Sienna to get us started.
Thanks, Aparna. So we have an hour with you all today. The first portion of our conversation is going to be a little bit of talking heads between myself and Aparna, sharing some information with you all, some strategies, some of our thoughts around what it looks like to build really community-informed research and programs. And then we'll have some time at the end for you all to partner together to do some reflection and think about maybe some programs or a project that you all might be working on currently and how you could better center the voices of the communities that you're aiming to serve. So that's a plug for later to maybe start thinking about a project or a program that involves some community engagement that you're working on now or you have coming up that you might workshop a little bit later. So for our key takeaways for you all today, again, we're focusing on community engagement, and really the best community engagement is built on trust. It's really dynamic, it's flexible, it's collaborative, and it requires creativity to address some structural barriers. And the end goal of a lot of community engagement is for communities to have agency over decisions that impact them. So thinking about scientists and research and outside experiences that are necessary, but how do you ensure that the programs, the research and projects that you're designing are designed by those who are most impacted? And in practice, approaches to this end goal can vary, but the focus of this workshop is going to be to move toward communities having greater agency over developing and employing community-informed research practices and wanting to make sure that you're creating more inclusive spaces for all community members. So whether that's partnering with local community members to translate library signage or provide books that are culturally relevant or develop programming that's reflective of the local community, there's a lot of different ways to do that, but wanting to ensure that you're really centering the community members you're aiming to serve. And then finally, we want to make sure that you're thinking about developing programming and projects that resonate with the local community and center their experiences and value the expertise that they bring to the space. So I will move us into the first part of our discussion, which is around sort of building some of this context for the importance of creating community-informed research. So first and foremost, community-informed research gives you more accurate and inclusive research and programming. And when communities are equitably engaged in program design and research design to inform that programming, it will be more effective for the community that you're aiming to serve. Equitable community engagement can also lead to applied research that more directly and positively impacts the communities who are at the center of that research. So often, marginalized communities' concerns and needs are erased or ignored by those who are empowered to make changes. Really compelling research can be a catalyst for change that actually addresses the root cause of the issues communities face, and the community has to be a partner in making that happen. Equitable community engagement should also create regular and consistent opportunities to partner with community members to inform and develop programming. Consistent feedback loops also allow for programming to be iterative and responsive to the needs of the community. And this is something that those of you who participated in the We Are Water project experienced firsthand. So you all went through a process of developing a project in partnership with Indigenous partners who supported various aspects of the project, including translation and design. And then through the process of creating feedback loops, participants and partners shared critical feedback that supported the next iteration of this project, making it more impactful for the community. Okay, and then the second reason, sorry, there's a long-winded piece around better research. The second reason why equitable community engagement is important is that we want to break patterns of history. So while we're not going to dive deeply into history, the histories around how public resources and services intersect with issues of fairness and access, we do want to provide some context around why trust-based community engagement is important, and also provide some broad context for why approaching marginalized communities with care is paramount. I'm going to pause for a second and just mute. There's some background noise. Okay, and if you all could just make sure you're on mute when you join, that would be great. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the legacy of systemic oppression in research. So concepts like racism, colonialism, classism, ableism, sexism, and more have been pervasive throughout the history of the US and present in how researchers and staff in public and private sectors approach community engagement. Colonial structures have been imposed upon Indigenous communities and tribal nations, and these structures have impacted Indigenous engagement. Indigenous communities and tribal nations are sovereign entities, yet they're still subject to and expected to conform to Western and US specific governance structures as articulated by federal and Indian trust responsibility. In the context of research, there's a long history across marginalized communities being subjected to inhumane research practices, a few of which I'll talk about now. So the first one is around obstetric trauma in Latina communities in the US. And from 1907 to the 1970s, state-sanctioned forced sterilizations were widespread, with 33 states that had eugenics boards that had the authority to order sterilization without proper consent. And in the 70s, there was a whistleblower at the LA County USC Medical Center that reported that Spanish-speaking women were repeatedly approached in the process of childbirth and pressured to sign English consent forms for sterilization. Another example I'll talk about is in 2003, researchers at Arizona State University collected DNA samples from Havasupai people and wrongfully assumed full ownership to the data, and the data was then used for additional research without the consent of the participants. The Havasupai tribe sued ASU, and the researchers came to an agreement where they received $700,000 in 2010. And then some of you may be familiar with Henrietta Lacks, whose cell line was taken through a biopsy during her cancer treatment without her consent and is continued to be used today for medical research. While these examples are in the not so distant past, and the Institutional Research Board, or IRB, now works to mitigate these issues in a research context, the historical trauma and distress still remain across these communities. The IRB is an imperfect institution that seeks to prevent egregious harm, but there's still harm resulting from continued uneven power dynamics between researchers and community members. In the paper, Indigenous Peoples' Data During COVID-19 from External to Internal, authors describe the legacy of research in Indigenous communities as inconsistent, inaccurate, and utilizing irrelevant data, lack of Indigenous control and ownership of data, negative experiences with untrustworthy, exploitative research and policy practices. So while this example is specific to Indigenous communities, the sentiment can be extended to many other marginalized communities. I also want to talk about the history of researchers exploiting marginalized communities for their own benefit. And this can happen through taking credit for community work, where researchers become the person who sort of discovered something, but the community is actually the one who identified and discovered that issue. Failing to credit and or adequately compensate community members for their participation and labor during the research process or program implementation. Creating and designing research projects that suit the career trajectories of the researchers or the desire of the funder, rather than really looking at what the community needs. And then misuse of community data. So communities participating in a research project only to have the data weaponized against them later on, or to have the community information shared publicly when it wasn't for public consumption. Researchers and outside experts have also taken on paternalistic roles, and this can look like discounting community knowledge as valuable or essential, assuming community members are unreliable narrators of their own experience where researchers are the objective observers, designing research and programs that center what the researcher or outsiders think is most important, rather than, again, addressing what the needs are of the community they're researching. And then there's ongoing oppression within research related to parachute science. And this is when researchers descend into a community for a short period of time and conduct research. And this can look like getting funding for research that's coming from large, well-resourced colonial organizations or government institutions. Scientists from well-funded entities sort of parachute in or drop into vulnerable communities, conduct research, and then take that data and use it for their own benefit. Not having local experts involved in the process. And then even if they do have local communities and local community experts supporting a project, they aren't given credit for their work. And finally, researchers, institutions, and their funders being the primary beneficiaries of the research that they're conducting. Next, I'll talk a little bit about having blame placed for challenges that these communities are facing being placed on them, whether that's the individuals or the communities themselves, rather than really identifying the root causes of the challenges, which are often systemic, or the structures that are in place that are causing the oppression. This can look like creating research questions or programs that are designed around an assumption that an individual or a community, that their behaviors are to blame for poor outcomes rather than systemic issues. And an example could be blaming community members for poor reading skills at the third grade level, rather than identifying some contributing other systemic barriers that are intersecting, right? So thinking about the lack of minimal wraparound services to support parents to provide additional learning resources for their children, or adequate transportation to public services like libraries where children can access auxiliary reading services. This is all to say that researchers have a history of placing blame on individual behaviors for what ultimately are entrenched in systemic issues. Finally, I'll talk about communities that have been flattened into a single identity, ignoring and erasing all of the various identities, experiences, and needs and views that exist within even the smallest communities. While we often advise listening to community members, we don't expect that there is going to be one unified voice about their experiences. They'll provide a kaleidoscope of input that you all as researchers and program and project administrators are then asked to make sense of. And while it's important to be able to speak to the broad implications that a policy or a practice has on an entire community, when doing community work, there is a difference between being able to understand how things like policies have broadly impacted and targeted entire communities versus understanding the myriad individual experiences within communities that inspire change and forward progress. So now that we have some context around what this has looked like historically and continues to look like today, we'll talk a little bit about some frameworks and guiding questions to lay the foundation for effective community engagement. So a few examples of guiding principles or questions on how to better understand specific communities you're working with are first to think about local or community history. So trying to understand what history has shaped the community that you see today. How do community members tell their own stories? And there's different ways to find those different stories, right? So you can have one-on-one conversations, or you can look at recorded interviews. You can look at formal historical writings. You can look at literature. There's a lot of different ways to pull together this research to really understand how that story is being told. Next, you want to ask, what are the community's culture and norms? So these can be common ways for people to gather, how they show appreciation with each other, how they communicate, the language that they use to describe themselves, and more. There was a thread that came that we continued to talk about as we were putting this together and working with Brooks and his team. And I know in the We Are Water project, there was a conversation around how water is talked about. And there was this discrepancy between communities, some of the indigenous communities they were working with, and how some of the folks who were building the program at Space Science Institute, and the ways that they talked about water, right? And so having an understanding of folks' different relationship to the concepts and the tools that you're using, and the language and culture that exists within that language is really important to being able to be responsive to the needs of the community. Next, I'll talk about what the needs of the community are. So there are more, this is more about the material needs that the community may have, whether that's around health outcomes or education, income levels, funding for school, right? The different aspects. Again, not making assumptions for the community, but really finding ways to ensure that you are creating space for community members to share what their needs are and building programs around those needs. What data is already available? So a lot of community needs may have already been documented, so that there's a way to look at existing research so that you're not asking a community again using a different tool or another survey, or potentially perpetuating some existing trauma that they've already experienced with projects similar to yours, and being able to utilize data that's already existing. And then finally, what is the community already doing to address the issues that you're interested in? Are they already working on some aspects of the project you're looking to implement? And then how are you able to partner with them to ensure that you're amplifying the work that they're already doing and providing supplementary support to continue to build on what's already in existence? And then there is the piece around understanding your own organizational or individual positionality with respect to the community. Understanding the community you want to work with is only one aspect of doing this foundational work. The other is around understanding your own position and the organization you're affiliated with. So first, asking what is the history of your institution or organization and its relationship to marginalized community. What is the reputation you have, and how might that inform how you approach the community you're looking to serve? What are the past engagements or research efforts from your organization or similar organizations, as I mentioned before? You can do a literature review for the community to see what other researchers have already done. You can do focus groups or one-on-one conversations to better understand what work has already been done here, and how can I make sure to not perpetuate any issues that are in existence, and then create more supportive, responsive, and inclusive practices to support this community. And then thinking about how your own identities impact your community engagement. So who's on your team, and how does that impact the way that you're able to engage the community? I will say that this does not mean if you are engaging a specific community and you recognize you don't have anyone on your team who holds a similar identity or a shared identity to that community, don't go out and just try to get someone on your team so that you have that representation just for the sake of having it. That can feel really tokenizing for that person, but you really want to make sure that you're partnering with community members who are representative of the communities you're looking to serve. And it's important to find and establish really authentic reciprocal relationships with the community you're looking to serve. This may also be a moment to pause and slow down your process if you recognize that you don't have the representation that you want to have on your program team or in the partnership team that you're working with. And then finally, what are the gaps in the life experiences present on your team? So for example, if you're working in a rural area, but all of your team members live in urban areas, this is a gap that you may have. And again, this may be a moment to pause and also has implications for other areas of your organization that may need to be further built out, thinking about hiring and recruitment, how we're making sure we're engaging rural communities so that we have representation within our organization to support this community we're looking to serve. And before I pass it off to Aparna, I'll talk a little bit about particular considerations for Indigenous communities and tribal nations. So engagement with Indigenous communities and tribal nations requires additional consideration and care because of the legacies of settler colonialism in the US. And while each Indigenous community have their own specific history, the history of settler colonialism has fundamentally impacted Indigenous communities and tribes' connection to their ancestral lands and ways of life. It has forced them to assimilate to Western styles of governance and culture, and resulted in a loss of legal rights even within those Western governance models. So first, you want to think about researching the particular history of the tribe that you are looking to engage with. And this includes relevant treaties and conditions under which a treaty was signed, often which were signed under duress. The next piece is around research history of the multiple different tribes that have a presence on the specific in the specific community that you're working on. There are often multiple tribes who share ancestral lands, and most often they are shared either through hunting or gathering, and not necessarily, permanent home sites, but there is still that deep connection to that ancestral land, and it's important to understand who is represented there. And then respecting that there's a ton of diversity within tribes. So this is connected again to respecting that even within specific tribal communities, experiences are not monolithic. One shared identity does not mean a collective shared experience. So there's diversity of age, gender identity, there's different generations that you're engaging and beyond. And it's important to recognize that there is that diversity even within specific tribes. Research the conflicts or disputes within and across Indigenous communities. And again, this is not so you can try to fix those conflicts, but for your understanding of what the potential intertribal conflict that exists. Engaging governments, community organizations, schools, and elders. Though tribal governments may be given particular status by US governments, it is important to understand that governments may have different interests than tribal elders or community organizations that support tribal members. So again, it's important to engage different tribal communities through different avenues. Respecting their knowledge and tribal knowledge. And this can look a few different ways. One of them is considering it as equally valuable to knowledge that's produced by Western science, and also respecting Indigenous data sovereignty. And then finally, understanding how current policies, programs, and structures within your organization and within the communities that you're working in may either bolster or diminish Indigenous sovereignty. So that's the context that I will share with you all specific to thinking about community engagement and its importance in research and aspects around program development. And I'm going to pass it over to Aparna to talk about our 4Rs framework.
So I want to dive into a framework that we found really helpful for, educators, folks in museums who are curating collections, folks in libraries who are creating programming, even folks who are creating like interpretive signage in national parks. And we call this the 4R model. It's around culturally relevant, revitalizing, responsible, and responsive curriculum and programming. And so I'll go over what each of these means and give you some examples and some guiding questions. And then we will end with you all being in discussion with each other. And I have a handout I'll share with you then as well. I want to lead with this quote that I've found powerful. When those who have the power to name and to socially construct reality choose not to see you or hear you, when someone with the authority of a teacher, say, describes the world and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked in a mirror and saw nothing. And this quote by Adrienne Rich has always moved me into thinking really critically about, when I was an outdoor educator, when I was an educator in a classroom, how do I make sure everyone who's engaging with this material can see themselves reflected in it? So the the four R's, the culturally relevant means that you're connecting your lessons or your programming or your curriculum to your learners' lives and culture. Culturally revitalizing means that it's really connected to relevance. It's about sustaining the culture and language of the learners' communities. And I'll go into each one in particular. Responsible means that you're addressing bias and consistently presenting multiple perspectives. This is probably often the meat of what we're doing is looking at this particular R. And then responsive is something you probably are all already doing well, which is how you employ all those different instructional strategies to reach all learners, right? You have visual, you have audio, you have tactile experiences, kinesthetic learning. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time on that fourth R. So to actually be able to figure out if this program that you're creating is sort of consistent with these four R's, I have some guiding questions for you. You'll see a lot of similar questions that than what Sienna presented at the first half, which was really around research. But it's the same questions, the same research really, which is so culturally relevant program is curriculum programming that connects lessons to learners' identities, culture, values, and daily lives. So to understand that, it's important to understand what are the demographics of your current and intended audience. I think about age and race and nationality, indigeneity, class, even, gender, faith. There are all these different identities in the area that you all are in, and really thinking about those demographics and the day-to-day experiences, knowing that no community is a monolith. What are the day-to-day experiences of communities who might be interacting with your program? What are their values and culture? So again, this is a really echo of what Sienna mentioned earlier. Culturally revitalizing is really connected to culturally relevant programming, and it's a new R that we added, which is really around sustaining the culture and language of learners' communities. And I would even go so far as to say sustaining the worldviews of the learners' communities. So guiding questions to ask yourself is whatever you create, is it centering the learner's language and knowledge and culture in ways? Oftentimes we center English and then we translate. But if most of the audience is not primarily English speaking, or if the audience for which the program is intended is not primarily English speaking, consider what about if we actually centered learners' language and then translated it into English? Does it center learners' worldview? So this is thinking about the We Are Water exhibit and ways that different learners interact with or have relationships with water. Does it center that? Does it see the learner as a source of knowledge instead of seeking to address a learner's deficit? So a lot of educational programming from the Western and colonial lens makes the assumption that the learner has a lot to learn, especially young people they have a deficit, and we are here as educators to correct that deficit. And when you have that deficit-oriented framework towards learners, you are not really seeing them as equals in learning, right? Learning is two ways. So learners are also, it's a two-way stream. They're a source of knowledge. Does it connect learning to histories of the learners' communities? So does it address, and does it specifically address legacies of settler colonialism and affirm tribal sovereignty and recognize the need to reclaim and revitalize what has been disrupted and displaced by colonization? So I wanted to, we've been talking about culture a lot, like what is the culture of the communities? What is the culture of the learners? And I think this slide is really helpful in understanding that stereotypes and cultural norms are very different things. And so if you're trying to understand culture or cultural norms within a community, oftentimes stereotypes have no context, stereotypes have no context, and cultural norms are really in the context of a community's values. Stereotypes are often negative, and cultural norms are not necessarily negative. Stereotypes are often based on assumptions and opinions and misinformation, very limited information, whereas cultural norms are really gathered based on observable behavior and experience within a community. Oftentimes it's a community themselves who are stating, this is our cultural norm. And it's really intended to be helpful, intended to guide positive outcomes. One thing I'm always looking for when I'm thinking about stereotypes versus cultural norms is words, language. So if it's like all, always, never, that is a stereotype, whereas often, sometimes, may, it's qualified, it's complex and qualifying. That is more the hallmark for me of a cultural norm. So I want to talk about some examples here. I just have one example of a lesson that our colleague Jose Gonzalez has introduced to us, which is about pollinators. I thought this would be a really helpful example to ground us in what can be culturally relevant and revitalizing programming. And so the way we can talk about, butterflies and pollinators as really important, and that they're being threatened due to climate change, and go down the path of talking about the science and just the science. But the way that Jose has talked about it is he presents this map. So this is the migration path of the monarch butterfly. And then he presents this other map. Sorry, both are pretty pixelated. And he asks students, like, what is this migration path? So this is the monarch, and this is another migration, which is very similar to monarch. And the answer is it's migrant farm workers. And in this connection between nature and people, he builds this very culturally relevant, and in the context of his students, who are primarily Spanish speaking, culturally revitalizing lesson around migration stories. So asking students, what is your migration story? Are there animals that have cultural significance to your community, similar to how the monarch butterfly has cultural significance in Mexico? So I really love this lesson because and I think this was a real, before you all logged in, we were talking, I think Angela, you were talking about a lesson on crystals, and how, as you were teaching students science of crystals, the way you taught it was through them experiencing crystals, through salt, through ice cream, through ice. And that connection can really be longer lasting, and actually connects to day-to-day experiences. So I wanted to bring that into this conversation as well. So that is one example of cultural relevance and revitalization. Couple of other examples is, using students' names. That is like when they can see even their types of names and like the ethnicity of their names reflected in problems. This is research, and it shows that they're more likely to have positive outcomes. When you connect young people to their own backyard nature in their own in urban areas, if you're talking about more remote nature, again, food systems, water cycle, air, green space, that's more culturally relevant. Even asking, how was that for you, instead of, wasn't that awesome, which is really coming from your own worldview. That is another way to make lessons culturally relevant. Again, the monarch butterfly lesson. Revitalizing is, teaching in the students' first language. And then also centering students' cultural ways in the program, whether it's meals, traditions, and more. I have also examples of a couple of different things I've encountered in my teaching experience that are not culturally relevant or revitalizing. A lot of pop culture icebreakers. It's really hard because students may not be familiar with, like, which Harry Potter house are you in? Or asking parents, or making assumptions about their family structure, like mom, dad. There are a lot of young people who are taken care of by other members of their family, or even adopted or in foster care. Making assumptions about where students live. That's another thing, like, and this is connected to family situations, but what their home situation is. Making assumptions about holidays, like, and then the fact that they celebrate them or don't celebrate them, like Thanksgiving and Christmas. And a very sciencey lesson that I remember teaching, and now I'm like horrified I talked about this in this particular way, is teaching about lichens, and saying Alice algae and Fred fungus took a lichen to each other, which seems really innocuous. But again, really, the narrative there continues to center like this heteronormative relationship between Alice and Fred. Like, why did they need to be gendered, right? So these are just some examples. I want to talk about cultural responsibility, which is really the bulk of analyzing your programming. This is really big, and we have a worksheet or handout I'll share on this. But we've really broken it down into 4 quadrants. When you're thinking about whether your lesson or program is culturally responsible, there's erasure and marginalization, stereotypes, appropriation, and unreality, imbalance, obsolescence and selectivity, and language and image bias. For each of these quadrants, I have a set of questions, and I don't want to go through, I'm not going to go through it in super detail because they're going to be in the handout that I'll share you and I want to share with you, and I want to be cognizant of time here. But for that first quadrant, erasure and marginalization, we're really looking at who is and is not represented in the learning, like who might be in the sidebars, like 10 great women scientists, and who's actually in the main text. And whether people are being referenced, specifically Indigenous people are being referenced in the past tense. That's literal erasure, right? So there's some examples I have here of lessons that really exemplify this particular quadrant, which is this here is around erasure. A picture on the right is of Awanichi people in Yosemite Valley who were only allowed to stay in the valley after the Mariposa Battalion removed them in the 1850s. They were only allowed to remain in the valley if they could be part of a cultural living history museum where they performed activities for white tourists, literally being erased as part of an exhibit. And then on the left, I just have examples of how at least in Canada, there's been this very consistent effort to use the language of the Indigenous people of different areas in talking about place, whether it's on maps or signage. Marginalization, this example here, Rainbow Book Month. I think we often try to celebrate these heritage months by highlighting like LGBTQ history, we'll do Rainbow Book Month, or women's history, we'll do women scientists. And I think in doing that, I think it's great. It's important. It's important to uplift and amplify particular communities and celebrate them. But in doing that, and then also not doing it the rest of the year, I think there tends to be this marginalization of like, this is the normal stuff we read and engage with, and this is the special stuff that we do in this particular month. The next quadrant is about stereotypes and appropriation and unreality. And the guiding questions that'll be in your worksheet there are around whether you're exoticizing or essentializing or stereotyping communities in your program. I often think about food. When you're talking about food, folklore, fables, festivals, heroes, and holidays, that's all fun and good. But that doesn't define a community, right? Communities are more than their food and their folklore and their fables. Also, are you caricaturing people, using these very stereotypic portrayals of them? Is there cultural appropriation? We could run a whole workshop on cultural appropriation, but really thinking about having permission to be able to use aspects of culture. Are there statements that are totally just false or unreal? Like talking about wilderness as pristine and untrammeled is something we often see in our work with environmental organizations, when the reality is people have been living in what we call wilderness areas for time immemorial. We have stereotypes based on gender that often come up. This is just an image of kind of the mainstream stereotype you may have across gender for youth. We have appropriation. This example here is around outdoor and place-based education. There's a whole guide on the left, Coyote's Guide to Connecting with Nature, that has some really great activities on place-based connection for youth. But at the same time, the entire guide, which is written by a white man, pulls from his experiences with the Maasai people in Africa and pulls very specifically from specific rituals that he engaged in a way that a lot of colleagues that I have who are working in the outdoor and environmental education space have found to be troubling and appropriative. And then on the right, we have a totem pole and a teepee. See, these are just like relics we see in the American camp, all of which have been appropriated for the most part. I talked about this as well. I'm talking about wilderness as untrammeled by man. And this on the right is a First Nations First Nations activist who says filmmakers and journalists stop saying my homeland is untouched. My ancestors touched every square foot of it. It's not thriving because it's untouched. It's thriving because it was heavily stewarded for tens of thousands of years, and it still is today by us. Okay, I'm looking at the time and I have 2 more quadrants. So I will be fast about these quadrants before you know, because we really want you all to engage with each other. Imbalance, obsolescence, and selectivity is really around whether there's a one-sided story, and that is very subjective and has a lot of assumptions behind it. And you can often just look at who is the author or photographer or illustrator's identity, when was it published, to really talk about this. The example I want to bring up here, which I think is a really great example, is in I can't remember this New York Times article. It's a Museum of American History, I think. They had this exhibit that had been there for a long time, and they decided to keep the exhibit, but ask folks in the museum to reconsider this scene. So this scene takes place in what's known as Battery, with ships on the horizon, you know, tribes, people in tribes wearing loincloths, etc. And what they did is they have in the exhibit itself, they say, you know, reconsider the scene. This is supposed to be an encounter between Dutch and Lenape leaders, and it was intended to celebrate the founding of Old New York. But there's a lot going wrong. There's a lot wrong about the representations here. And then as you zoom in, it talks about all the different ways that there are stereotypes and really inaccuracies in this image. Women in the background, what the women are wearing, what the men are wearing, and more. There's this hyperlink that's in this slide here that you all can read the article in more detail. And then finally, language and image bias is really a catch-all to think about how you are portraying, and not just the exhibit itself or the program itself, but like the language you're using and the imagery you're using. And just checking the language, making sure it's inclusive, checking the imagery, making sure you can see who's portrayed and who's not, who is at the center and who is in the margins. I'm going to leave it at that. And again, not going through the 4th R, because the 4th R is something I know that you all probably do really well, which is around culturally responsive programming, employing all these different instructional methods to reach learners who learn in different ways. What I do want to do is share, I'm going to throw a worksheet into the chat. Everyone, okay. Hopefully this works. It's a PDF. And if you go to the chat and pull up the PDF, it has all the 4 R's in it. And this is the worksheet you're going to be using in your breakout sessions. And then the questions, I'm going to put the prompts actually in the chat as well for the activity. Would love for you all to take a few minutes to just reflect on one project or program or event that you all are working on in your respective region and organization, and consider all the questions below here that were outlined for your breakout room discussions. So what aspect of your program is in alignment with that 4 R's model? What areas have you not considered? What barriers exist to considering these or addressing these gaps? And what resources do you need? So those are the 4 questions we'd love for you to discuss.
And if
Fiona, is there anything more you want to?
Yeah, only thing I'll say is that this chat goes away when you go to your group for your breakout. So maybe just copy and paste that list of questions so that you have it with you while you're in your breakouts. And I'll give you all a second to do that before I send you to breakout rooms. Brooks, do you want to go to a breakout or do you want to stay?
Yeah, I would love to go to a
Okay, great. You're
breakout.
in one, so I just want to make sure I didn't have
Cool.
to move you around. Okay, great. I am going to send you all to breakouts. You'll have 10 minutes to be in there and be in conversation. I know, oh wait, I'm no, actually, okay. A couple of you will have 2 people in a room. Some of you will just have 1. I am gonna move 1 person. Tori, I know you're on the phone, and so please just in driving, so please feel free to not not engage if you can't. And anyone else who is not able to talk right now, that's okay. Please feel free to just listen. Okay, we'll see you all in about 10 minutes.
Do you want me to go into a new room?
Oh, I was gonna say it wouldn't normally. Oh, you're not a co-host. That's why. Never mind. No, I don't.
Is there anybody all alone?
I don't. Let's see where Michelle is
One person,
supposed to be.
Toby, signed off.
Yeah, they were on the phone, so that makes sense. I had put another person in that room just in case they dropped. Michelle. Okay, so there's at least for Michael and Beatrice have each other in room one. Yeah, I was looking for an option, you know, it'll say like, don't include co-host or whatever, but yeah, you're not a co-host.
Oh. I think we didn't have a Zoom link for later today.
For later today for Earth Echo. Did you, we need one in there, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but they just emailed and want theirs. I'm gonna just say
Okay.
use ours.
Fine. Yeah, just let them know we'll add it when we're off of this Zoom.
You're the organizer, so I can't edit it.
I'll do it. Yeah,
Yeah.
when I can't edit it. Right, you can't. I can't access my Zoom link right now because I'm on it. Right.
You just go to the calendar invite and
No, I'm
add
saying to
your-
like copy and paste my Zoom details.
Do
While
you
you're
have your you don't have a separate like a note with like your room details?
I don't. I'm gonna do that now that you said that.
I'll send you mine and then you can put it in. How about I'll send you mine.
Okay. Well, I feel like that's something they should really work on though. Like you should be able to copy your Zoom details while you're on a Zoom.
Yeah, I think so. This depend. You have your own Zoom room, which always has the same number, and then when you create an event, it creates a unique room.
Right.
So this room you can invite people to it, but it's not going to be the room that. So I'll send you a private chat now.
Okay. You can also send it in G chat if you want, or that's this. Okay.